Hello, Zer0 Books readers and viewers. This is Craig from Acid Horizon, and today my guest is Neil Usher, author of Unfucking Work, a new Zer0 Books title arriving this month on the imprint. This book positions itself as a business book for those who can't stand them. It is a work which advocates for a rethinking of work, our reasons for it, and the necessities it entails. If you'd rather not be at a meeting or mindfulness training, there might be something in here for you. In any event, work has been fucked for quite some time, and Neil submits that it needs a good unfucking. And that means first going after a set of collectively held beliefs that keep the grind in motion. I'll leave it to Neil to explain all of that. But before that, Neil, welcome to Zer0 Books.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Let's talk about this book. If we go to the back cover, there's a blurb, and it says that this book, Unfucking Work, situates itself as a business book, but one that stands apart from other business books, one not like the others. Could you explain the impetus for writing this book and maybe tie in a bit of your background and how it ultimately might find itself in the business section of the bookstore when maybe it should be placed somewhere else?
Certainly. I like to hope that it doesn't follow the sort of time-honored formula of business books, which really introduces a problem which may or may not exist. And you get a model, a formula, a theory, panacea, paradigm, and usually someone else to blame, someone to point the finger at, and then it just gets repeated over and over, restated in various ways. I've read a lot of business books that just really should have been a blog post. Realistically, that's about what they amount to. But so kind of rinse and repeat is really the way that most business books run. But I think mainly I'm trying to get much further upstream. One of the real drivers for this book was my own personal experience of working. I'm in my sort of later years of work, probably done about sort of 3 decades, a little bit of a break for some further education, but probably sort of not far short of about 40 years in the workplace. And a lot of it was playing back that experience to myself and just really thinking about decisions I'd taken, situations I'd been placed in or actually placed myself in, the people I worked with, their motivations and agendas. But sort of processing all of that, we need to get much further upstream than most business books get. They're paddling at the sort of shallow bit, really. Kind of darker places, really, in terms of that sort of, with the further we get upstream to real causes, I think it gets really uncomfortable. And one of the things that I really found emotionally when I was writing the book was I felt uncomfortable a lot of the time as I was writing this stuff. So I imagine that in reading it, you'll probably recognize some of your own working life and the experiences you've had, and that will feel uncomfortable too. So really, I think it goes to the places that the business books aren't likely most of the time to go. Where in the bookshop will it be? Well, if they don't put it in the business section, I'm not really sure where they put it, but I'm very happy for them to put it on those big tables at the front. That'd be fantastic. But otherwise, I have no idea. Someone described it as a work of literary non-fiction rather than a business book, and I quite like that expression. But if I describe that as to someone else, they've probably got no idea what I'm talking about.
Now, you have 2 collaborators on this book, Kirsten Buck and Perry Timms. I think it's always interesting when a book has more than one author, and it seems that some of their work comes in at the end of the book. But could you explain the role in developing the ideas that you've put forward?
Yeah, sure. Perry's an old friend of mine. We've sort of been in the kind of probably the more sort of HR area of what I do for quite some time. He's got his own business. He absolutely practices what he preaches, and he's a real sort of rebel, really, in the sense of just not wanting to play the usual corporate game. And he really sort of lives and breathes what he talks about. So huge lot of admiration for Perry. And Kirsten's one of his team. Kirsten works with Perry, and Perry and I used to kick around there's just so much bullshit out there. One day we should just sort of take it all down and really sort of get to grips with all of this. We originally agreed to write it together, but for one reason or another, I just got cracking and just started churning out chapters, principally over a sort of Christmas holiday, and really started enjoying it. So I was sending them to Perry, and Perry said, "Look, I'd like to get Kirsten involved." So they were my sounding boards, really. They challenged me, they motivated me. If I started flagging, they would keep me going. They were very critical in a really positive way about what I was writing, offered me some ideas. So hugely grateful to them. I do tell them that I couldn't have written it without them. And I'm rather hoping they sort of enjoyed that whole process as well.
We were talking a bit before we started recording, and based on what you say now with respect to Kirsten and Perry, it seems that this whole venture was kind of like a collective act of consciousness raising between the 3 of you, in the sense that, you know, that was a world in which you had been ensconced for decades of your life. And of course, seeing the tensions and problems within that world, and then you start pushing against them and then explicating it on the page. What was it like for you then once you saw all of those sort of quiet tensions that had built up for so long just kind of spill out onto the page? Did it change your perception of work? Do you think it manifested a shift in your political viewpoint or the way that you viewed the relationship just between everything in the kind of world that we live in?
Without doubt, sort of reignited my sort of kind of political consciousness. Absolutely. Because a lot of the issues I started getting into, once you started with some of these issues, very often you just can't stop. You just have to keep going. Once you start moving upstream, you just keep on moving. I've always been a little bit, I guess, sort of bit frightened of it, if that's the right expression. What was created, there's a sort of sense that, whoa, I've actually sort of crossed some lines I never thought I'd cross here. I've got into some territory I wasn't sure I'd be writing about. And how do I feel about that? And so Kirsten and Perry were also great in just saying, no, you're in the right place. In fact, a good friend of mine told me I hadn't gone anywhere near far enough, which I was actually quite surprised about. But it was very emotional at the same time because I was playing back a lot of my own experiences of work and experiences that others have had of work, but a real focus on sort of what it means for us and our role in all of this. If we look at social media channels now, it's just a whole world of pointing fingers at other people. It's just finding someone whose responsibility it is. And I'm not one of those people. Whereas actually, when I look back over my sort of career, I've been a manager, I've been a leader at the same time that I've been a worker. And I know that I've made some bad decisions. I've treated people badly, done things that I'm really sort of embarrassed about. And that sort of process of writing was somehow just sort of getting that out of my system. But it was also just a sort of a reckoning really of the journey that I've been on personally. And hopefully something in expressing that makes it okay for other people to admit that to themselves. When they look in the mirror, when they reflect on what they're reading, I'm just really hoping that it helps them to sort of somehow emotionally deal with that too.
Right. A lot of the way that you're talking about this book regards the sort of affective dimension of work and your affective experience and memory of your careers. And there's occasions at which in the book you kind of brush past the structural elements of what makes work fucked, as it were. Maybe this is a time to sort of get into the meat of the book. Well, let's talk about the first chapter. At the end of the first chapter, which you've entitled, "We Are Where We Are." And this is one of these statements that you want to dismantle or unpack and show how some of the sort of collectively held beliefs that we have about work kind of float around in our brain as we move from job to job or we move up the corporate ladder in any given business, right? You state that we're all kind of collectively mired in a Stockholm Syndrome when it comes to work. And what is necessary, and I thought this was interesting, is a rewilding or an undomestication of today's worker. When I read this, it immediately made me think of the quote by philosopher Soren Kierkegaard, where he suggests that a tame goose never becomes wild, but a wild goose can certainly become tame. And so this, of course, is not the most savory prospect, but I'm wondering, what would it take for us to disavow the habits of domestication that you see prevalent in today's workplace and work culture? And could we prove old Kierkegaard wrong?
It's a great quote, actually. But then again, he was always a barrel of laughs, wasn't he, really? You had to enjoy his life. I think it's really about this sort of inner sense of freedom. I think the tame goose might never become wild, but I think it would certainly enjoy sort of the open skies and clean water and just sort of the fresh air. I don't necessarily think it involves us rewilding to the point that we become feral in some way, but I think it's that inner sense of freedom, the freedom within ourselves. And I think really the starting point of it all is accepting our bit part in it. It's the first step to freeing ourselves, is the recognition of the journey we've been on, what we've done, the attitudes we've held, the actions we've sort of propagated. And to refer back to a point I made just now, that it's always the sense that it's someone else doing this to us. It actually makes it really easy for us. If we don't think we can change anything, and we think someone else is responsible, we're just sort of waiting for them to do it. And social channels these days give us the opportunity to just vent and to say, this isn't right, this shouldn't be happening. And then we go and do something else entirely. And it means we don't really have to do anything about it. But it always begins with us. It begins, just as it did for me with writing this book, it begins with us thinking about the work that we've done in our life. And as we were chatting before this, you've come from a sort of a more traditional background as well to get where you've got to. So I'm sensing really that you've probably been through that sort of that kind of transformation yourself, and you probably started with yourself as well.
Sure. I think for a lot of us, it happens in fits and starts. There's a kind of an indefinable or amorphous tension that we feel in the work world, maybe after having our expectations deflated. And then at some point, there's a much stronger impetus to start thinking about the situation and maybe consider the broader dimensions, the social dimension, the class dimension to our problems. And that's the way that I kind of started out in this path. I'm curious for you, I mean, since we talked about a rewilding or an undomestication, were there any significant moments in either producing this book or maybe in your later work life where you said, that's it, that's the last straw, or something has to be done? Like, what was it for you? What was your experience maybe similar to mine in a sense?
I haven't done anything dramatic in that way. I think the process of writing the book was my first step really into just that sort of reigniting my own personal consciousness, which I felt it was about time. When I first had the conversation with Perry about the book, and I've still got the piece of paper somewhere, I just sort of divided it up into 12, 14 sections. And each one of those was just my immediate sort of brain dump, my outpouring of frustration about each of them, thinking about all the books organized in terms of the expressions that I think sort of codify and solidify the world of work that we experience. And so I was just taking each one of these apart, a whole series of notes. So that became the plan for the book. It was literally one side of paper, and it was just crammed full of just my immediate frustrations. And that was really the first step of that consciousness. And then basically I took one of those phrases at a time and started with a blank page. And I had no real plan for the book other than just, right, okay, what am I going to focus on this week? And just did it sort of piece by piece in no particular order. I mean, there's no structure to this. It's a series of skits really, or essays that sort of deals with these phrases and deals with the subject matter, things like trust and things like measurement. They're all the sort of features of our working life are just dealt with one by one. So once I got that sort of initial plan out of my system and I got it on a piece of paper, I thought, yeah, I can do this. Then there was a whole series of a dozen or so of these sort of tapping into my own consciousness again and reigniting that consciousness. On each time I sat down with a blank screen to deal with the next one, I could feel that sort of emotional pressure rising each time I dealt with it.
The two standout chapters in the book for me were chapter 2, which is on meaning, and I think it's chapter 10, which is on measurement. In chapter 2 of the book, you address two concepts related to work, the meaning of work and the notion of alienation as it's construed in Marx's 1844 manuscripts. And as you point out in Marx's Analytic of Concepts, he has this notion of alienation, which not only has to do with the appropriation of the labor that gets turned into commodities as they're produced, but also the affective dissociation and the sort of muddled personal investment that work under capitalism tends to instigate. Part of what makes capitalism's mode of production so problematic is that we lose sight of ourselves, we lose sight of each other, and we tend to lose sight of the bigger picture of things amidst our laboring. And you write in the book that meaning in work can be and should be universal. Wherever, whenever, whoever, paid or unpaid, however distanced from the eventual product or outcome, adored or detested, as long as it needs doing as a critical test, it can mean something to us. Now, one of the challenges, as I see it, is that the meaning of work is one of those sites of contestation for the very forces that make work as fucked as it is, which I think is the kind of system that we live with under, which is capitalism. And capitalists hold a major stake, namely in manifesting a sort of general ideology about the alleged virtues of work. But it's also the case that many workers become habituated to certain patterns around their own exploitation that can be mildly reinforcing and therefore produce a relatively universal sense of meaning amongst them, even if it's just in terms of that kind of low ebb solidarity that many workers share with one another in the workplace. But so all that to say that I would suggest that sometimes certain meanings developed around work serve to recuperate the forces, which then destabilize the meanings that we've created around work in a kind of double movement. Do you agree with this? I mean, certainly you have some experience with regard to this. And if so, do you have any strategies to get around this fact?
I mean, that is a cracking question. We should have had a chat before I wrote this book. I spent ages going through this, and I might have written a slightly different book as a result of this. But I mean, it's a great question. I think this sort of habituation to the patterns around our own exploitation, yes, I definitely agree with that. It becomes all we know. We create the world we know, and we just seek better versions of it. I mean, something that we hear a lot about at the moment is the Great Resignation.
Yes.
It sounds like some sort of major act of spirited rebellion.
I hope it is.
Well, what I'm seeing is it's just people swapping one job for another one. I think it's just another expression of that habituation, really, in many respects. And this notion somehow that in resigning, I'm leaving this bad place over here and there's this fantastic place over here, and everyone's just crossing that line. And all people are doing is crossing the line, and some are moving from one side to the other, some are moving from the other side back again. And is it any better than they were experiencing before? No, we're just seeking better versions of what it is we know within the scope and the confines of that habituation. And I also find it really sort of quite interesting that people who move from kind of corporate life to self-employment often see it as a sort of liberation from those patterns as well. Somehow I've broken free. Well, you might have broken free from an employment contract, but it's all still feeding the same system. There's no, realistically, you're just going to be providing services to companies who are feeding that same system without necessarily any of the benefits that might accrue from what you have to put up. So I'm not even sure that is particularly rebellious a lot of the time either. But it does start with us. It does start with that why of work. But I think it also starts with a need for a lot more robust questioning of ourselves. And I think I do sort of mention it already in this conversation, and I mention it many times in the book, is that we have to sort of not fob ourselves off as we often do, not sort of stopping at, why do I work? Well, I need to pay the mortgage and next month I might get a trip to Frankfurt or something. It's like that. Okay, that's fantastic. I've answered the question. I can move on. And I go back to living in that same space again. I think we give ourselves personally a far too easy time of it all. And that is what's helping to perpetuate this sort of really quite sort of low level pattern of exploitation a lot of the time. And that sort of habituation that if we can't elevate our own consciousness of it, then really we've got no chance of doing anything collectively.
I mean, it's interesting, maybe just as an aside to this, I was going to ask you about the Great Resignation a bit later in the discussion, but it's fine to talk about it now. I don't know what it's like. Well, I do know somewhat what it's like in the UK, but here where I live in the US, I think fast food restaurants, for example, are one of the places that are really having a hard time finding workers. And it seems as if, and I'm not, to be honest, I don't have all the facts and statistics on this, and I'm sure it varies from locality to locality, but the dearth of workers has now prompted those companies, a place like Wendy's fast food, or we have Dunkin' Donuts here, or McDonald's or whatever, in a place that has $7.50 minimum wage. These companies are now offering $14 and $15 an hour, which was something that maybe as recent as 5 or 6 or 7 years ago was a highly contentious debate, even in some of the most liberal states in the United States. And those places did achieve it. After the legislation was passed, it would rise incrementally over a period of like 5 or 7 years or something like that. But now they're putting forward the $15. It's almost as if it was there the whole time. So, I mean, I agree with you. We're on the same page with respect to the idea that it can feel like freedom to have this sort of lateral movement between similar positions. Okay, over here at Wendy's, I was making $10.50 an hour. Now I'm making $13.50 over here. I mean, it is a marginal improvement, and depending on your lifestyle, that can actually be a great improvement. But I think you're right. I think what happens is we don't, amidst that sense of freedom in the lateral movement, we get somewhat of a sense of the contours of the structural oppression, but we're not getting out of it, like you said. So the Great Resignation might ultimately fizzle in the sense that, well, after a time of some tumultuous movement, things will kind of settle in and everyone will kind of go back to their normal thing or fall back into their normal set of habits. But for me, something more needs to happen. Some kind of solidarity needs to be generated. If we are putting pressure on those that pay us to pay us more, well, what would it be like to organize and set those terms a little bit more firmly? That's just the way that I think about it.
No, absolutely. No, I think some great observations in there. It's sort of something else we're seeing. It's certainly seeing in the UK, there's a sort of spark of militancy among the trade unions at the moment, which I wouldn't necessarily want to put in the same bracket as the Great Resignation. I think while those sort of trade unions are responding to a cost of living crisis, a massive hike in energy prices here, and they're looking for improved terms, I think one of the things that's been really interesting is they brought to light where a lot of the money goes in the system. We've got access to this kind of information and this kind of transparency that when I think back to when I was in my late teens, when I was probably most politically active, you couldn't find this information out then. There was no internet. There was no discovering where the money went. It was a really sort of difficult task. Whereas now it's all sort of publicly available and it's easy to find. I think what's been really interesting in this activity is that at least we've become much more aware of what sort of a business being owned by shareholders means for those who are working in that business, and particularly sort of its relationship then with political structures and with government as well, and how business and government are related. Because when I think back as well in terms of that sort of political consciousness, I remember it being really clear in the sort of late 1980s, but we haven't seen a lot of that since, really. And it's just that little sparks just kind of can rekindle some memories of those times, really, when particularly sort of younger people were very politically aware, politically conscious, and very sort of motivated by a better world and the opportunity for a better world in so many respects. I really hope that sort of continues, and that sense of justice re-emerges in the way that I recall it from my late teens.
We get sort of kettled into these ideological ghettos online, and just with the influence of mass media and the algorithms, if that kind of organizing and militancy is not something that's on your radar, well, you're not going to get a good sense of where it's really happening. But once you sort of get into those corners, I think you do tend to see a little bit more. But to your credit, I think you are seeing a little bit more of it these days with respect to Strike Wave, with the organizing of Starbucks and Amazon here in the US. So I think there are prospects out there. I kind of throw in with a little bit more radical element. I mean, I'd like to abandon work altogether if I could, which actually kind of takes me to the next question, because, of course, I am not out of the capitalist system. I'm firmly ensconced in it, but one could say that I am in the knowledge economy right now. You have a section in your book called Undefining Work, and you have in the crosshairs these workers in the knowledge economy. And not only do they comprise a minority amongst workers in general, but you suggest they are more demographically homogenous than a more inclusive workplace would typically allow for. You also seem to suggest that their privileged position in today's pantheon of worker archetypes may be an impediment for generating the kind of consciousness and real solidarity that's required amongst workers of all types. I was hoping you could put a finer point on what you think comprises the knowledge worker. What kind of person is the knowledge worker? Especially because I think many of those things, like I said, refer to somebody like me. I'm not involved in tech or anything like that, but I'm definitely not disinterested in helping workers out. But from a structural standpoint, as I sit behind my computer here in my home studio, I've lost some connection with them. I'm not at the workplace. So it raises the question of how do we create a sort of metastable continuity amongst different kinds of workers to generate the kind of consciousness and generate the kind of awareness that would allow us to make either structural changes or take us to the next level, whatever that is.
I appreciate the knowledge worker is pretty difficult to define. I think we've got a sort of general idea of it being a sort of a knowledge worker being an office-based sort of PC or sort of tech sort of wielding professional. Knowledge workers are also those involved in sort of very location-specific activities as well. Surgeons, doctors, they're all highly qualified, highly skilled people who would call themselves knowledge workers, but they're not in that sort of MacBook under their arm working in the cafe kind of knowledge worker. But I think the knowledge community, the knowledge working community has actually sort of developed quite a consciousness of its own. And I think in many instances, my sense, and this isn't something that I can sort of lay data or prove, but it's just the sense I get is that actually it has broken away in many instances from the rest of labour. And it's done that intentionally. It's sort of, we understand one another. We understand what pressures we're under, and this is what we want out of it. And when we look at the Great Resignation, that is fundamentally a knowledge worker phenomenon as well. I don't think that means in any way that they don't have an interest in those who are not knowledge workers, but I do sense that gap is widening, and I think the pandemic gave it even more of a shove. And if you look at any kind of social media channel, really, and I'm probably excluding TikTok from this, which I've just started to get my head around, and it is a very different world. But they've been pretty much colonized by knowledge workers. They've got the time, they've got the means, they've got the ability to engage. So they talk to one another, and they create this knowledge worker bubble that's self-reinforcing and gradually moves them away from the rest of the working community. But they're still a minority, just a very big minority in sort of most developed economies. But I think the first sort of starting point for sort of bringing them back really, again, rests with themselves. They have to sort of stop seeing work as though something that just purely takes place through a phone or a pad or a laptop and takes place in an office or at home. We look at the Great Resignation, that really is sort of a knowledge worker phenomenon. It's knowledge workers wanting more flexibility, not wanting to go into city centres to work in an office all day. It's quite it's more of a hygiene factor really in terms of place of work than it is anything fundamental to work. It's not really getting anywhere near upstream. But I'd say at the beginning of the book, this is about all work. And I had to work quite hard at this myself, really. All the examples I give through the book are non-knowledge work environments. They're non-office environments. And I had to place myself in those situations as much as I did in knowledge worker environments. And I've done a whole series of jobs in my life which are not knowledge work, not as much experience as I have of being a knowledge worker. But I do think it's really important that this sort of sense of privilege amongst the knowledge worker community is acknowledged. It's a really important starting point. And we have to just stop talking about all work being able to take place at home. The vast majority of it cannot. Most work is still place dependent, location dependent. People are brought together to work in that place. And that's really where all this has to begin.
Yeah, I think there's definitely an ideological dimension to the whole knowledge worker, online worker phenomenon, which is in some senses valorized. It's valorized amongst young people. I think something like YouTuber or content creator ranks high amongst potential career choices for young people. And I think you're right. In order to maintain the very edifice which makes that work even possible, it is based on location. There are folks working at the substation to keep the lights on, for example. Not only that, there are an elite class of those workers, but there's plenty of strivers behind them, much like somebody trying to get into professional sports. And none of that, as you said, dispels or dismisses the exigencies which keeps this economy moving anyway. I might have a relative sense of freedom here in my home. I do have bills to pay, so forth. But in the last instance, we're all responding to the same pressures.
And during the pandemic, most people whose work was location dependent, they still went to work. They often put themselves in greater risk than those of us who were able to work from home. And I think certainly for a period of time, those who were within that knowledge work community developed a huge respect for those people who carried on working in hospitals, who carried on driving buses and trains, and who just kept going, creating food, doing all the things that were necessary to allow the rest of us to work at home. But I'm sensing that now the pandemic is predominantly over, or at least is something we've got completely used to in our lives, that we're very quickly forgetting the respect that sort of grew inside us for those sorts of roles and the people fulfilling those roles. And we can't lose that. It was a really important time for us to understand that actually a huge amount of our life is made possible by people who do have to show up for work every day.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure if the pandemic is over. I think it's just gotten fused with our sense of normalcy. In fact, we have other contenders for most deadly new disease on the rise. But I'd actually like to shift gears a little bit and talk about maybe something that I push back against a little bit in the book, which is the notion of necessity of production. Also, on the meaning of work, you write, finally, all work should be needed, and therefore none should go without meaning. In the sense, its meaning is universal. It's not the case of either or, a question of degree. Sometimes work is needed to prove that it's not needed, to close off an avenue. That's an interesting sentence. I was hoping to unpack this statement. For starters, my cards on the table. I am a fan of the flagrant and the unnecessary. I enjoy wasting time, and there are certain indulgences I'd prefer to have. And I don't think I'm alone in this. That said, what, in your view, best drives or ultimately drives this logic of necessity with respect to labor? For my part, I feel that our whole understanding of productivity has been fucked for a long time. I think that's been habituated into us. It's been conditioned into us. And I'm hesitant to embrace claims that the axiom of productivity can be turned firmly towards positive ends, as it often becomes an end in itself. In fact, on Zer0 Books earlier this year and on my other channel, Asset Horizon, we've talked about the work of Georges Bataille, the French author. And he goes after this. He said not only under capitalism, but under forms of communism, like Stalinist communism, for example, this notion of productivity was elevated to the highest maxim. The problem is, in the end, productivity doesn't become a means, it becomes an end. And once we do, that's the thing that we tend to reproduce is more efficient means of doing things. And it eats up the time, energy, resources, and bandwidth that we wanted to secure for ourselves in building the better world, so to speak, that would give us the 4-day work week or what have you. Ultimately, can we unfuck our understanding of productivity and necessity while we're at it? Where do you come down on this?
It's so unbelievably vague, I think, productivity. I mean, it's both subjective and objective. So much of what I sort of get involved in my day-to-day deals with a very subjective notion of productivity and how productive I feel. I mean, I could be super efficient at generating all sorts of error-strewn crap all day and call myself productive. And the organization might call me productive as well if that's what they measure. So quite possibly it's just a completely sort of self-perpetuating sort of needless generation of things we don't need. But I've spent most of my working life in sort of corporate environments. And while I've seen good work performed in those environments, I've seen heaps of work performed that just wasn't needed. Monthly reports that someone spent days preparing, but no one ever read because they've always been done and no one ever said, hey, I don't need this anymore. Well, why didn't you say I don't need this anymore? Well, I didn't want to upset them. I mean, most of it's noise and we have this sort of perpetual sense of busyness that we're doing stuff and we go looking for more stuff to do. When we're in a corporate role, we want to put our name on projects. We want to be involved in things that are happening, particularly if they look like they're going well. And they don't look like they're going very well. We do everything possible to get our names off those projects and disassociate ourselves entirely. But I don't think that means that the routes we take to get there shouldn't allow for getting lost and for some undulation. And I don't think we can necessarily confuse the sort of process of getting there with what we're actually looking to create. I'm not suggesting that it's all about this sort of functional A to B and that's all we need to be concerned at. That feels quite a draconian way of looking at it. And I'm hoping it doesn't come across in that way. I mean, you sort of talked about sort of wasting time, it helped. But I imagine that what happens is that helps you perform when you need to. You're doing something with your mind that is preparing yourself in some way or kind of decompressing after you've done something where you need to sort of regenerate or just sort of help yourself prepare for the next thing. I mean, I've got through, this is the end of the week. I'm not working next week. So I've had to do sort of loads of stuff that I would ordinarily have done next week as well. But I've had one eye on a test match, a cricket match going on all day, which I know is a British thing, but it's been there all day in the corner of my mind. And when I want to sort of break my concentration and just take a breath and do something different, I've been doing that. And you could say, hey, you've been sitting there with one eye on the test match. It's like, yeah, but I've needed that. And I've had to have that because it's enabled me to do all the other things I needed to do. So I don't think we can strip it all down to productivity only by any means. And I think we do have to understand that at a personal level, we've all got a different way of getting there. And that some of what we do is not necessarily contributing directly to that productivity, but it's certainly helping us to do what we need to do a lot better because we appreciate what it is we need to do to prepare and then to sort of to come down the other side from that.
Yeah. The problem has been all along is that there has been a tacit hierarchy, and maybe not so tacit actually, where we put productivity on top of consumption. And then that creates all kinds of problems. And ultimately, I think what would be best for most of us is to have a sort of holistic sense where somehow productivity and consumption were operating in some kind of equilibrium. But I think it's an interesting thought experiment to sort of invert the hierarchy, as it were, to take the notion of consumption, to rupture productivity, as you do. Like you have these little moments in the day where you escape, but that is all done in the name of recuperating the sort of mindset of productivity, or at least finding escape or respite from it. And when I first saw the title Unfucking Work, the ideas of George Bataille came to mind, which is, how can we reclaim that part of our lives where our labor, for one thing, isn't being appropriated by somebody else, even at the level of, like I said, wasting time, or like, this is a do nothing day. And it serves nothing else other than that purpose. It's a kind of anti-purpose in some sense. This is one of the challenges that I have with the axiom of capital, is that it does not allow for that kind of thought. We either have to find a way to escape slip out from underneath it, get away from it, but it always comes back to us. Like the necessity comes back. We got to pay taxes. We have to pay for the groceries, or we don't. We could steal them as well, depending on what your proclivities are. But I just think it's an interesting challenge to the notion of productivity itself is like, how can we live a world geared more towards consumption, a reasonable form of consumption, or at least dash the reasonability of productivity?
Absolutely. I mean, I think we also have to remember as well that for knowledge workers, it's much more easy for them to waste time and get lost. They're able to make those choices during the day and to plan their day. I remember one job I had, I was between jobs and I had about a month where I wasn't working. So I went to a sort of manual work agency and said, look, I need a month's work. I don't want to do anything. I don't want anything on a desk. I don't want anything in an office. Just whatever it is, chuck it at me. I'll go do it. So I worked in a stationery warehouse where for a big company, it's a big corporate, but we worked in this little place that was like, it was just like isolated from the rest of the world somehow. And all that happened was the different branches sent their orders in and we packed boxes of stationery. I stood opposite this guy who was also a sort of keen interest in philosophy. And we just talked about this stuff all day and we packed boxes of stationery. All we did was we stand at our station and when we'd filled the box, we put tape on it, put the address label on, passed it off. Little bell would go when we went for tea. And when the tea break was over, the bell would go, we'd get back to our station again. And that's pretty much how the day went. And it was fascinating. I mean, did I want to do that all the time? Probably not, but I loved doing it. I loved the conversations I had, people I met. Did I have any control over my day? Absolutely none. I had no choice about what I did and when. I was either working there, doing what I was doing, or I wasn't going to work there. There was no wasting time. The only way I could lose myself was actually in the conversations I was having or in my own thoughts while I did what I did. And for many people, that realistically is what they have available to them in the course of their work. So again, there is this sort of knowledge worker sort of divide, really. There's this sort of knowledge worker ability to do some of these things. And knowledge workers have much more time and resource and available and also just generally space available at their disposal to make some of these choices. And that is part of the privilege in the sort of knowledge worker community.
Your example of working in the stationery factory, what that says to me is there's a certain ecstasy of fusion or communion or communication that you experienced, but the trade-off was a kind of coercion. You had to set yourself on the grid with those workers, their timetable, the demands of the company, the boss, or what have you, in order to achieve that experience. And I think this is the crux of the problem, is that the very prospect of that kind of real solidarity and communication that we feel with people in an up-close environment. And I think it can happen online to a certain extent as well. Sometimes it happens only in virtue of this sort of abject exchange that we make. Here's my time, my energy, my labor, and so forth. But now I'm with this people and I feel like a very real visceral connection with them. We can go back to talking about Stockholm Syndrome. I can remember a time in my working life, this hasn't happened recently, but maybe 10 years ago or so, I would have bouts of what I would call negative nostalgia for jobs that I had that were absolute shit, or I just hated them. But I would reflect upon the music that I was listening to at that time, maybe the kinds of meals that I was eating at that time, the sort of fantasies that I had at that time, in lieu of not really having something else to attach to. So, just in a kind of self-analysis, I was sort of circumambulating these different moments of my own personal working past, the relationships I made, the kinds of things that I was fantasizing about or doing at that time outside of work, the art that I was consuming was somehow attractive. And it was just really odd. And maybe if I was taking a walk in the city where I worked, for example, maybe to sort of honor that or to act upon that negative nostalgia, I just walked by the building, for example, almost revisiting it. So that's just me. Maybe I'm just hardwired differently. Maybe somebody else has had that kind of experience. But I think once I had a taste of the political consciousness, I think that was antidote to ever feeling that again. Or at least if that feeling became present, it would get short-circuited or cut off by that new political consciousness. But I don't know. Am I alone in this? Neil, have you had negative nostalgia?
I have, and I think we're all a library of stories, I think. We all tell stories from our working life. And very often as we extract those stories, we forget the sort of environment that they're in. We forget the sort of the pool of tree that we've drawn them out of in a way. But I mean, I've spent a lot of my time in sort of creating workplaces. And so very often if I go and walk past those buildings or those workplaces, I've had actually something to do with bringing them into being in the first place. That's a quite sort of odd feeling as well. But I don't think you're alone at all. I think we all do that. And we'll find ourselves telling stories from time to time, sharing conversations, when I worked here or when I worked there or when this happened. But you do pick up on an interesting point, really, with that sort of sense of solidarity from being in one another's proximity and one another's presence. And I do pick up on that because it gets caught up in this whole argument about whether people should work at home or people should work in an office. Realistically, it's not about the actual location. It's just about that sense we get from being in one another's proximity, which I think is incredibly important, whether it's in an office or elsewhere. One of the things I do worry about is that our relationships will become much more fragile, will become much more fractured, where if we rely on online only. And actually, most of our work has become, when we spend more time working at home, it's become more transactional in every respect. And our relationships have become more transactional, which means actually what's happening is becoming much easier to join an organization now and much easier to leave an organization because we don't feel that emotional connection with the people around us. And so I do have genuine concerns about our sort of loss of humanity in all of this, really. And I do notice that these days, I'm really sort of trying to be as objective and observer it quite seriously, really. Do I want to do that 5 days a week? Well, probably not. But, I certainly need a lot more of it than even today I'm experiencing.
This brings us to the next point. One of the things that I hate the most about work, which is measurement and management. Have I ever been a manager? I don't think I have. I've had responsibilities of the higher sort, but never been a manager. I think there are innumerable, maybe an unmeasurable problems with the setting of measurable criteria and gathering of data, which typically accrue to an increased demand on the worker and, in more recent times, relatively less remuneration and satisfaction produced for the worker by these forms of measurement and management. I've seen excessive, if not laughable, applications of quantitative measurement employed in educational institutions in a way that reflects the worst of what is normally utilized in the private sector. And so in your chapter on measurement and management, you summarize what you think are some of the major problems with respect to the way measurement and management occur in the workplace. And moreover, you exposit some of the more interesting history behind it. Could you recount some of those items and tell us, how do we unfuck measurement and management?
I think the heart of the problem really is that sort of as the phrase that opens the chapter, the phrase that the chapter's all about, if we can't measure it, we can't manage it. So it does, as you suggest, tie measurement and management very closely together. Somehow, if I think I've got some data that has been measured, I'm in control of a situation or I'm in control of people. But that phrase was the very first one that I wrote down when I started thinking about the book, because it's probably the one that's pissed me off for more time and more intensely than any other. And I quote a Hindu thinker in the chapter whose article I sort of clipped out from a website years ago, where he basically said, look, we do things differently. He said, we find that what we can't measure is really interesting. And that just stimulated a thought at the time, which never left me. And it's probably at least 10 years ago that I read this little article. And I couldn't really find anything more about the author or what he was really up to on a day-to-day basis. But fascinating idea that actually it's the very fact that we can't measure something that makes it something that really we ought to pay more attention to. Because that sort of helps us realize how much of work we're actually trivializing if we think, you can measure that. Well, yeah, just crack on, just do it, because it's not really going to tell us anything. Because most measurement is based on effects and not the causes. It measures the outcomes, what happens after a series of people or processes or machinery is brought together. Something happens and we can measure that. But as I mentioned a little earlier, the whole driver for this book really was to get to causes and not simply to consider effects. These days, we have to remember that people get hired, they get appraised, they get their salary is determined, they get fired, and it's all based on measurement. And it's all based on measurement of things that very often those people that are subject to it would actually dispute, or there are nuances, or there are reasons why actually the measurement that's being quoted, there were other dependent factors. It wasn't just down to them. How could they potentially have controlled that situation? But there is some data. And we've been reading recently about sort of probably the worst of it all, really. If we thought the 9 blocker was bad enough, and I don't think you've ever been in an environment with the 9 blocker where you were sort of basically scored in terms of your performance and your behaviors. Your behaviors down one axis, your performance across another. And if you're in the bottom right-hand box, you're off. That's basically how the 9 blocker works, effectively. If you're in the bottom right-hand corner, you're in trouble. But we've got the worst of it all now, which is all of this data all of these measurements are then aggregated as they relate to you, and they're rolled up into your employee score, which means that any of the outliers, any of the nuances are just automatically steamrolled in the aggregation process. And you have a number or a figure or a data point attached to you in terms of all the work you've done and all the output, all the outcomes you've created, and all of the contributions you've made come down to one figure. I mean, this really is so far removed from sort of the essence of work and the essence of being a human being. It's taken it far too far, in my view. But the central problem here really is this notion that most measurement in industry, most measurement in our working lives is the effects and not the causes, the things that are of interest. That's how we can genuinely change things, is getting to the causes, and we can very rarely measure the causes. That requires a lot more thought, attention, application, not just us standing there with some sort of device of whatever sort, electronic or otherwise, that is going to generate a data point.
I throw in with the analysis of imminent causality, in the sense that the reason that we generate these modes of measurement, the reason that we gather data, comes from the more general fact that the kind of economy that we live in demands a constant kind of growth, and it will do so at the expense of different kinds of getting rid of certain kinds of workers, valorizing these attributes over these. But there's also an absurdity to it too. As you said, sometimes the modes of measurement don't truly capture the essence, if you will, of what is driving a workplace culture, for example. I mean, you might get somebody out who's underperforming under these indexes, but what is this person, the presence of this person in the work environment, doing for the overall sense of satisfaction, the work culture, the cohesion, and so forth? Those things tend not to get indexed. Beyond that, I think the demand, the exigency for measuring all sorts of data points is that ultimately these things are commodifiable in and of themselves. They can be sold back to the market, to other companies, and who's to say that record will not follow you around? There's somewhat of a tendency towards streamlining not only the ability to gather this data, but to parse it, to analyze it, and then, of course, to sell it and utilize it. This is where, once again, I think I throw in with the politics of refusal, in that I don't see a positive end for measurement or the forms of management as we understand them in today's capitalist milieu. Granted, in certain work environments, there is difference. There are people with leadership capabilities. There are people who prefer not to lead. There's sort of type A and type B personalities. And I think we can organize a workplace or function in a workplace on the basis of these differences. The problem is that they end up becoming commodified in the ways that I've been talking about.
Well, I think there's an interesting sort of idea around where this might sort of lead to, really. It sort of comes back to me to the sort of Nietzschean idea that all great things destroy themselves. I tend to think that sort of what's coming really is that sort of in this instance is something sort of around the idea that systems eventually consume their creators, and those people who, a lot of these measurement systems and the use of technology algorithms for measuring performance, measuring output, eventually they're going to consume the people who've been using them, and whether they've been using them fairly or not, but the line will shift. I think there's this sort of sense really that somehow the workers are subject to the measurement and the managers are not, but that line will shift. And so I think the really interesting end game in all this is sort of how far the systems do eventually consume all of those who've been using them and created them in the first place.
Yeah, I think a lot of management positions, this is more of a prediction than anything else, but will become a more nominal status. But I think structurally, they'll be closer to the worker. But I think that the function of that position will be nonetheless to recuperate the kinds of patterns that we've been talking about all along here. Well, maybe just a final question before we wrap up. I've been alluding to this notion of the anti-work politics. But maybe I'll shift my question a bit. Amidst what we've talked about and on the basis of what we talked about prior to hitting the record button here today, I'm wondering if in the wake of completing this book, and you said, well, if I had met you or talked to you prior to writing this book, maybe things would have turned out differently. In the course of waking up, as it were, becoming more conscious of the situation, do you think if you were to rewrite Unfucking Work again, would there be big changes, little changes? Has there been anything today in the present political milieu that maybe would put a different focus on the book?
I don't think a different focus. What has happened is that the more I've shared it with people who I think might find it interesting, and some of the comments you've made is the sort of has increased my awareness of the work of others in the process. And I think if, the difficulty with writing a book at any point in time is sort of when do you stop, really? Where do you draw the line? Whenever you write something, there's always an opportunity to explore that further, to unpack it further, to bring in more influences. And during the course of the writing process, I had to sort of stop myself doing that. Say, look, I could go down this route, but I tried to keep each one of the chapters at a reasonably similar length. That was a pretty rudimentary way of just making sure that I didn't just sort of go off down avenues and rabbit holes that I didn't want to go down. But I've been made aware of, through great conversations I've had, by really interesting work that I'd never been aware of and I hadn't had the opportunity to research or explore. So I guess I might have brought some of those ideas and some of those references in. But again, I didn't want this to grow any bigger than it became. I think it's one of the things I have found in writing books before is that attention spans are fairly limited. We have to hit the points we want to hit quite succinctly and quite quickly very often to hold interest. You picked up on the fact that there were a couple of chapters that really piqued your interest. As I've said to a few people I've given the books, you don't have to read it all if you don't want to. There's no structure to it. If there's a particular phrase that grabs your attention, then, I'm sure most people will have a chapter or two that really resonates with them, and then some that are okay, and then some that they don't particularly relate to. But that's because I tried to write something that wasn't in that sort of business book formula where you really are stuck with 250 pages about the same thing. There's lots in here, lots of different ideas, lots of different sort of possibilities to explore it. So in a sort of fairly long answer to your question, no, it probably wouldn't be a lot different. But what I think it enables me to do, I've already got a number of other phrases that have been bandied around in some conversations where I think I'd like to have a go at that one as well. I think there's every possibility of writing some more in the same way, in the same sort of style, but not necessarily changing this sort of core text too much.
So what you're saying is we can look forward to Unfucking Work, the sequel.
I hope so, yeah. All depends on whether this resonates with people. I mean, we as a writer, we have to be very aware that we're putting it out there and we have to see how it's received. And if it's positive, then yeah, I'd like to keep going because I really enjoyed it. As I say, it's a bit scary at times and I'd probably scare myself again. But I think certainly the process of exploring some of these issues about looking sort of deeper into my own work in life and my own experiences and sort of playing a lot of those back has been hugely cathartic for me. And I think I've enjoyed that process. However much at times I thought, oh God, did that really happen? Did I really do that? Was that really the situation I was in? But it was a really helpful process, I think, emotionally as well.
I actually suggest, and I think this was indicated in my questions, maybe you would do well to take a look at some of the anti-work literature that's out there. Kathy Weeks, also Jason Reed, who we've had on our show on Asset Horizon and here on Zer0 Books. He has a forthcoming book on the politics of work. So yeah, it would be interesting to see what you come up with in the future. And I really appreciate you saying yes to this interview because our interview today will be released in September and your book comes out in September on Zer0 Books, and it was just wonderful having you on the show.
Fantastic to be here. Thanks so much for talking to me. Great questions, really challenged me, and we'll get a chance to talk again, but thank you.
We appreciate your support of the imprint and the channel. Subscribe to Zer0 Books today on Patreon. Your material support helps us to promote a variety of perspectives on the left. Also, discover the many titles, new and old, that Zer0 has curated. Navigate to any of the links in the show notes to extend your support.